Marcus Reynolds drove slowly through the quiet streets of his hometown, Oak Ridge. The evening light cast long shadows across the familiar roads he hadn't seen in almost 2 years. At 42, Marcus had spent more time away from this place than in it, but something about the air still felt like home. He adjusted the rearview mirror of his mother's old blue sedan. The car was nothing special, a 2008 Toyota with fading paint and a slight rattle when it idled. Marcus preferred it this way. In his line of work, blending in was second nature. The dashboard clock read 7:43 p.m. as he turned onto Maple Street. His mother would have dinner waiting, probably her famous pot roast. Marcus smiled at the thought. After 15 years with the CIA, simple pleasures like a home-cooked meal felt increasingly precious. The flash of blue and red lights in his mirror cut through his thoughts. Marcus checked his speed -32 in a 35 zone. He signaled and pulled to the curb, his training automatically kicking in. Stay calm. Be respectful. No sudden movements. Two officers approached, one on each side of the car. The taller one, with a name tag reading Kendrick, tapped on the driver's window. The other officer, Sullivan, stood back slightly, his hand resting near his holster. License and registration, Kendrick said, not bothering with the greeting. His voice carried an edge that Marcus recognized immediately. Of course, officer. Marcus kept his movements slow and deliberate. May I ask why I was pulled over? Taillights out, Kendrick replied, though Marcus knew this wasn't true. The sedan had passed his mother's safety inspection just last week. As Marcus handed over his documents, he noticed Sullivan was already scanning the inside of the car, flashlight beam cutting across the back seat. Where are you headed tonight? Kendrick asked, studying the license too intensively for a routine traffic stop. Just visiting family, sir. My mother lives on Elm Street. Kendrick's eyes narrowed. You don't look like you're from around here. I grew up here. Just don't get to visit much these days. Sullivan circled to the back of the car. Step out of the vehicle, please. Marcus complied, keeping his hands visible. The situation was escalating without reason, but he knew better than to object. His CIA identification was hidden in a secret compartment in his luggage, standard protocol when traveling domestically. For now, he was just Marcus Reynolds, civilian. Stand over there, Kendrick directed, pointing to the front of the car, hands on the hood. Marcus followed instructions while the officers began searching the car. Through the windows, he could see Sullivan opening the glove compartment, then checking under the seats. Minutes stretched by. Well, what do we have here? Sullivan emerged from the back seat, holding a small plastic bag with white powder. Marcus's heart dropped. He knew with absolute certainty it hadn't been there before. That's not mine, Marcus said calmly. I don't know where that came from. Yeah, that's what they all say, Kendrick replied with a smirk. Turn around. Hands behind your back. As the cold metal of handcuffs closed around his wrists, Marcus maintained his composure. Inside, his mind raced through procedures, protocols, and the chain of command he needed to alert. Whatever game these officers were playing, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Marcus Reynolds, you're under arrest for possession of controlled substances, Kendrick recited, tightening the cuffs. You've had the right to remain silent. A small, almost imperceptible camera in Marcus's watch recorded everything as the officers guided him toward the patrol car. This was far from over. The holding cell at Oak Ridge Police Station smelled of bleach and sweat. Marcus sat on the metal bench, his back straight against the cold wall. 3 hours had passed since his arrest. The booking process had been unusually quick, as if someone wanted to rush him through the system. Reynolds, your phone call, a guard announced, unlocking the cell door. Marcus followed the guard to a wall-mounted phone. He dialed a number few people knew existed. Not his mother, not a lawyer, but a secure line to CIA Operations Control. Accounting Services, how may I help you? A female voice answered. This is Echo 7 Lima. I have a Blackbird situation, Marcus said, his voice low. The coded message would tell headquarters everything they needed to know. An agent compromised, possibly targeted. Confirming identity. What was your first assignment location? Ankara, 2009. Handler code Griffin. A brief pause. Confirmed. Status. Level 2 containment. Local police, Drug charge. Evidence planted. Request shadow protocol. Understood. Maintain cover. Do not reveal identity. Legal support incoming. Check-in expected every 6 hours. The call ended. Marcus returned to his cell, knowing wheels were now in motion. Shadow protocol meant the agency would observe before acting, gathering evidence on the officers who had targeted him. 2 hours later, officers Kendrick and Sullivan appeared at his cell. Well, the drug dealer finally gets to see the inside of our fine establishment, Kendrick said, smirking through the bars. Marcus remained silent, studying them. Sullivan was nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Kendrick, however, seemed almost pleased with himself. Not talking. Smart move, I guess, Kendrick continued. Though it won't help, we found quite a stash in that car. Looks like you'll be our guest for a long time. I'd like to speak to my attorney, Marcus finally said. Sullivan laughed. Oh, he talks. Well, sure, you can talk to an attorney tomorrow. It's late, and the duty public defender has gone home. I don't need a public defender, Marcus replied evenly. Kendrick's smile faltered slightly. Right. Well, you've been processed. Court appearance is set for Monday morning. Till then, enjoy our hospitality. After they left, Marcus closed his eyes and reviewed his mental map of the situation. The officers had moved too quickly, too confidently. This wasn't random harassment. They had targeted him specifically. By morning, a new face appeared at his cell, a tall black man in an expensive suit. Mr. Reynolds, I'm Darius Washington, attorney at law. Your mother contacted me. The guard opened the cell, allowing Washington to enter with his briefcase. The officers claimed they found cocaine in your vehicle, Washington said once they were alone, supposedly hidden under the back seat. It wasn't mine, Marcus stated firmly. It wasn't in that car when I was driving it. Washington nodded, making notes. This isn't the first time these officers have been involved in cases with questionable evidence, but they'd always managed to make the charges stick. What happens next? Marcus asked, although he already knew. Arraignment this afternoon. I'll push for bail, but with drug charges, it can go either way. Meanwhile, I've filed for all body camera footage and patrol car recordings. What Washington didn't know was that CIA technicians were already accessing those files, including the ones that would mysteriously be reported as corrupted or missing when officially requested. Marcus nodded, playing his role perfectly. Thank you. As Washington packed up his notes, he paused. One thing bothers me, Mr. Reynolds. Officer Kendrick's report says they pulled you over for an illegal turn, not a taillight as you mentioned. Their stories are already inconsistent. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Interesting. Very interesting. The first cracks were already appearing in the officer's carefully constructed case, and Marcus hadn't even begun to fight back. The fluorescent lights of the county jail hummed overhead as Marcus sat on his bunk, watching the other inmates. 3 days had passed since his arrest. His arraignment had gone as expected. The judge had set bail at $50,000, citing the significant amount of drugs supposedly found in his possession. His mother had been in the courtroom, her face lined with worry and confusion. What no one in the Oak Ridge justice system knew was that across town, in room 412 of the Holiday Inn Express, CIA agent Sarah Chen had set up a makeshift command center. Sarah unpacked her laptop and connected to a secure satellite uplink. At 35, she had worked with Marcus on 3 continents and trusted him with her life. Now, it was her turn to have his back. She pulled up the personnel files on officers Kendrick and Sullivan that the agency had obtained. Well, what do we have here? She muttered, scrolling through Kendrick's record. 6 civilian complaints in 8 years, all dismissed. 4 involved minority suspects claiming evidence tampering. Sullivan's file showed similar patterns. The junior officer always backing Kendrick's version of events. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Package delivered. Translation: the monitoring devices planted near the officers' desks and patrol car were now active. Meanwhile, at the law offices of Washington and Associates, Darius Washington was building his own case. The police department had responded to his request for evidence with partial footage, claiming technical difficulties with the body cameras during key moments of Marcus's arrest. They think I was born yesterday, Washington told his assistant, Lisa. I've seen this before. They conveniently lose the footage that would clear a suspect. Lisa handed him a file. I pulled every case these officers testified in over the past 3 years. There's a pattern. They target out-of-towners, especially minorities, with rental cars or vehicles with out-of-state connections. Washington nodded. And Marcus fits the profile, driving his mother's car with DC license plates. But there's something else, Lisa said. I checked Marcus's background. His employment records are strangely vague. Government contractor for international security consulting, whatever that means. Washington leaned back in his chair. Everyone has a right to a defense, Lisa. Even mysterious government contractors. Across town at the police station, Kendrick and Sullivan sat in Lieutenant Driscoll's office. The lawyer's asking questions, Driscoll said, his voice low and angry. Washington is a problem. He doesn't play ball like the others. Kendrick shrugged. So what? Evidence is solid. We found the drugs. And the body cam footage that mysteriously stops working right before you find the drugs? Driscoll asked. This isn't some nobody you can railroad. His mother knows people in this town. Sullivan shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we should just let this one go, Jim. Drop it to a lesser charge. No, Kendrick said firmly. I'm not backing down. This guy was smuggling drugs into our town. We caught him fair and square. What none of them realized was that every word was being captured by a device disguised as a power outlet cover installed during a fake fire alarm inspection the day before. Back at the jail, Marcus received his second visitor of the week, an unremarkable man in a gray suit who signed in as John Smith, legal consultant. Once alone in the visitation room, Smith spoke quietly. Director's watching this personally. We've identified similar cases going back 5 years. This goes beyond 2 corrupt cops. Marcus nodded slightly. I thought as much. What's the play? We let it go to court, Smith replied. The preliminary hearing is where we'll make our move. Washington will get a surprise package of evidence tomorrow. Your cover holds until then. As Smith left, Marcus returned to his cell with renewed purpose. The trap was nearly set. Soon, officers Kendrick and Sullivan would learn the true cost of targeting the wrong man. Morning sunlight filtered through the high, barred windows of the county jail's common area as Marcus joined the other inmates for breakfast. After 9 days in custody, he had established a routine and kept to himself, quietly observing the prison dynamics. Some of the guards now nodded to him, the quiet, respectful prisoner who caused no trouble. Guard Wilson approached his table. Reynolds, your lawyer's here again. Marcus followed Wilson to the familiar visitation room where Darius Washington waited. His expression different today. There was a hint of excitement behind his professional demeanor. Mr. Reynolds, Washington said loudly for the benefit of the camera in the corner. Then he slid a yellow legal pad across the table with a note. Room swept for bugs yesterday, clear to talk. Marcus nodded slightly. Any developments? Washington opened his briefcase. Several, actually. First, an anonymous source delivered a package to my office yesterday. It contained what appears to be the complete, unedited body camera footage from both officers during your arrest. How interesting, Marcus said, keeping his voice neutral. And what does it show? Everything. Washington's eyes gleamed. Officer Sullivan clearly plants the evidence while Kendrick distracts you at the front of the car. It's as plain as day. Will the court accept anonymous evidence? That's where it gets better, Washington continued. I took this to Judge Harris as potential evidence of police misconduct. She issued a subpoena for the original footage from police storage. When they inevitably claim it's corrupted or missing, will that proof they're covering up evidence tampering? Marcus allowed himself a small smile. You've been busy. There's more. The package included documentation on 14 other cases with nearly identical circumstances. Same officers, same approach, same mysterious discovery of drugs. Always targeting minorities, always out-of-towners. At the Oak Ridge Police Department, Kendrick paced anxiously in the locker room while Sullivan sat on a bench, head in his hands. We're screwed, Jim, Sullivan whispered. Judge Harris subpoenaed all our body cam footage. All of it. Calm down, Kendrick hissed. The footage is gone. It already confirmed the server malfunction affected those files. But what if there's a backup somewhere? What if? There isn't. Kendrick cut him off. Nobody can prove anything. Lieutenant Driscoll appeared in the doorway, his face ashen. My office. Now. Once inside, Driscoll closed the blinds. Washington has a copy of your body cam footage. Complete and unedited. That's impossible, Kendrick insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Apparently not, Driscoll said, loosening his tie. The DA just called me. They're opening an investigation into evidence tampering. Sullivan collapsed into a chair. Oh God. Pull yourself together, Driscoll snapped. Here's what we're going to do. Reynolds will be in court tomorrow for his preliminary hearing. Before that happens, I want you two to visit him. Offer him a deal. What kind of deal? Kendrick asked. The kind where his charges disappear if he walks away and forgets all about this. No complaints, no lawsuits. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen worked tirelessly in her hotel room, coordinating with CIA headquarters. The surveillance had yielded more than expected, connections between the corrupt officers and a local drug distribution network. The department wasn't just framing innocent people, they were eliminating competition for dealers who paid them protection money. Director wants to expand the operation, her supervisor told her over a secure line. This goes beyond helping Marcus now. We're looking at a joint task force with FBI and DEA. Sarah nodded. Timeline? 24 hours. Keep everything contained until then. That evening, as Marcus prepared for sleep, he noticed officers Kendrick and Sullivan approaching his cell. Their faces told him everything he needed to know. They were desperate men making their last move. The endgame had begun. Reynolds, you got visitors, the night guard announced, unlocking Marcus's cell door. Marcus sat up slowly, noting it was 9:35 p.m., well past normal visitation hours. Officers Kendrick and Sullivan stood outside his cell, Kendrick's face a mask of forced confidence, while Sullivan couldn't hide his nervous energy. Let's take a walk, Kendrick said, gesturing toward the hallway. The guard led them to an interview room with no cameras, a detail Marcus immediately noted. When the door closed, leaving the three men alone, Marcus positioned himself with his back to the wall, facing both officers. What can I do for you, officers? Marcus asked calmly. Kendrick leaned forward. Look, things have gotten complicated. Maybe we all need to step back and consider our options. I'm listening, Marcus replied, his expression revealing nothing. The preliminary hearing tomorrow doesn't need to happen, Kendrick continued. Cases get dismissed all the time. Technical issues, paperwork problems, it happens. Sullivan nodded too eagerly. We could tell the DA the evidence was mishandled. The charges would disappear. And what would you want in return for this? Generosity? Marcus asked. Kendrick's smile didn't reach his eyes. You walk away. No complaints, no lawsuits, no talking to reporters. You go back to D.C. or wherever and forget Oak Ridge ever existed. Marcus studied them silently, allowing the tension to build. The watch on his wrist, standard CIA equipment, was recording every word. That's an interesting offer, Marcus finally said. But I wonder, is it just for me, or is this how you handle all your special cases? Kendrick's expression hardened. Don't get smart with me, this is a one-time offer. And if I decline? Sullivan shifted uncomfortably as Kendrick leaned closer. Things get unpleasant. Drugs move around in jails. Sometimes more show up in an inmate's belongings. Charges pile up. People get lost in the system for years. The threat hung in the air between them. I'll need to think about it, Marcus said. You got until morning, Kendrick said, standing up. Choose wisely. After they left, Marcus was escorted back to his cell. The moment the guard was out of earshot, he retrieved a tiny transmitter hidden in his mattress seam and activated it, a prearranged signal to Sarah Chen. Across town in her hotel room, Sarah received the alert. She immediately dialed a secure number. It's time, she said simply. They made their move. At FBI headquarters in Washington, Assistant Director Thomas Rivera reviewed the case file that had landed on his desk an hour earlier. The CIA didn't often share operations, but this one had expanded beyond their typical jurisdiction. Are we sure about this? he asked the agent standing before him. The evidence is solid, sir. Recordings, documentation, witness statements from previous victims. These officers have been running this scheme for years. Rivera nodded. And the CIA operative they accidentally caught up in it. Agent Reynolds has maintained his cover perfectly. His preliminary hearing tomorrow is our entry point. Coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office in that district, Rivera ordered. I want federal prosecutors there tomorrow. This case is now a joint operation. Meanwhile, at Washington's law office, the attorney worked late into the night, preparing for the hearing. His assistant Lisa brought him a fresh cup of coffee. You should get some sleep, she suggested. Washington shook his head. Something's not adding up. Reynolds is too calm for someone facing serious charges. And these officers? They've done this before, but never been caught. Why now? Why him? Maybe they finally picked the wrong target, Lisa suggested. Maybe, Washington agreed, studying a photograph of Marcus from his military service years before he joined the CIA, a detail Washington hadn't yet discovered. Or maybe there's something about Reynolds we still don't know. In his cell, Marcus closed his eyes but remained alert. After 15 years in the field, he had learned to rest without truly sleeping. Tomorrow, the officers who thought they had power over him would discover just how wrong they were. The trap was set, and they had walked right into it. The Oak Ridge County Courthouse buzzed with unusual activity. Local reporters gathered in greater numbers than typical for a preliminary hearing, tipped off that something noteworthy might unfold. Officer Kendrick noticed this immediately as he entered through the side entrance, Sullivan following nervously behind him. Why are there so many reporters? Sullivan whispered. Kendrick shrugged, maintaining his confident facade. Probably a slow news day. Inside courtroom 3, Judge Eleanor Phillips reviewed documents at her bench. At 49, with 15 years on the bench, she had seen her share of routine drug cases. This one, scheduled as a simple preliminary hearing, had already raised several red flags in her mind. At 9:55 a.m., the side door opened, and Marcus entered in handcuffs, escorted by a bailiff. His expression remained neutral as he took his seat beside Darius Washington. Only the attorney noticed the slight nod Marcus gave to a woman sitting in the back row, Sarah Chen, though Washington didn't know her name or significance. All rise, the court officer announced as Judge Phillips prepared to officially begin the proceedings. The door to the courtroom opened again, and 3 people in dark suits entered, taking seats directly behind the prosecutor's table. Lieutenant Driscoll, seated behind the officers, frowned at these newcomers. Who are they? He whispered to Kendrick. Before Kendrick could answer, District Attorney Robert Jameson stood and approached the bench, joined by a woman neither officer recognized. Your Honor, before we begin, there's been a development, Jameson said. This is Federal Prosecutor Marina Diaz. The U.S. Attorney's Office has requested to join these proceedings. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Phillips raised an eyebrow. This is unusual for a simple drug possession case, Ms. Diaz. Would you care to explain? Diaz nodded. Your Honor, what began as a routine arrest has uncovered evidence of a much larger issue. We have reason to believe this case involves civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and abuse of power by law enforcement officers. Judge Phillips leaned back in her chair. That's a serious allegation, Counselor. We're prepared to demonstrate the basis for these concerns, Your Honor, Diaz replied. Washington stood next. Your Honor, in light of this development, the defense requests all charges against my client be dismissed immediately. Judge Phillips turned to the district attorney, Mr. Jameson. The district attorney looked uncomfortable. In light of new evidence brought to our attention this morning, the people have no objection to dismissal. Kendrick's face flushed red. He grabbed Jameson's arm. What are you doing? He hissed. Judge Phillips noticed this. Officer Kendrick, please take your seat, or I'll have you removed. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened again. A distinguished man in his 60s entered, flanked by 2 agents in dark suits. The crowd fell silent as he walked toward the front. Darius Washington turned to Marcus. What's happening? He whispered. For the first time since his arrest, Marcus smiled. Justice, he said simply. Judge Phillips looked at the newcomer. Counselor, who is this gentleman? Marina Diaz stepped forward. Your Honor, This is Director Edward Roberts of the Central Intelligence Agency. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Kendrick and Sullivan exchanged panicked glances. Order! Judge Phillips commanded, banging her gavel. When silence returned, she addressed the director. Mr. Roberts, would you explain your presence in my courtroom? Gladly, Your Honor, Roberts replied. The defendant, Marcus Reynolds, is a senior operations officer with the Central Intelligence Agency. He was unlawfully arrested and framed by officers Kendrick and Sullivan. All eyes turned to Marcus, who sat calmly as the bailiff, following the judge's gesture, removed his handcuffs. Furthermore, Director Roberts continued, Agent Reynolds' detention has inadvertently uncovered a pattern of corrupt practices within the Oak Ridge Police Department that now warrants federal investigation. Sullivan sank into his chair, face pale with shock. Kendrick remained frozen, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. In targeting a random black man driving through their town, they had unknowingly captured a CIA operative and sealed their own fate. A heavy silence filled courtroom 3 as Director Roberts handed Judge Phillips a folder containing Marcus Reynolds' classified service record. The judge reviewed it carefully, her expression shifting from skepticism to astonishment. I see, she said finally, closing the folder. Mr. Reynolds, I'd apologized for your ordeal. All charges are dismissed with prejudice. Marcus nodded respectfully. Thank you, Your Honor. Federal Prosecutor Diaz approached the bench. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we would like to present evidence of systematic misconduct by officers Kendrick and Sullivan, as well as other members of the Oak Ridge Police Department. Objection. Lieutenant Driscoll stood up, his face flushed. This hearing was for a preliminary examination on drug charges. The prosecution can't suddenly turn this into an investigation of the police department. Judge Phillips fixed Driscoll with a cold stare. Lieutenant, I'm allowing it. Sit down. FBI agent Kevin Barnes set up a laptop and projector. The lights dimmed, and the first video appeared on the screen, crystal clear footage from Officer Kendrick's body camera showing the night of Marcus's arrest. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the video showed Kendrick deliberately distracting Marcus while Sullivan planted the bag of cocaine under the back seat. The audio was equally damning. Make sure he doesn't turn around, Sullivan whispered on the recording. I know what I'm doing, Kendrick replied. Not my first rodeo. When the lights came back on, Sullivan had his head in his hands. Kendrick stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, but the evidence was just beginning. Your Honor, Diaz continued, we have compiled evidence of 15 similar cases over the past 3 years involving these same officers. In each case, the victim fits a specific profile, minority, out-of-town visitor, driving through Oak Ridge. Sarah Chen approached with another set of files. Diaz handed these to the judge as well. These are sworn statements from 7 previous victims who were pressured into plea deals despite their innocence. 3 lost their jobs. 1 lost custody of his children. All suffered significant harm from these false arrests. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. This had become much bigger than a simple case dismissal. Darius Washington stood. Your Honor, in light of this evidence, my client wishes to provide testimony about what he witnessed during his detention. Marcus took the stand and spoke clearly, his CIA training evident in his precise recollection of dates, times, and conversations. While in custody, I observed officers Kendrick and Sullivan meeting with known drug dealers in the visitor area. Based on their conversations, which I documented in detail, they were arranging to target competitors and protect certain dealers in exchange for payments. Lieutenant Driscoll jumped to his feet. This is all lies. You can't prove any of this. Actually, Marcus continued calmly, every conversation was recorded. He pointed to his watch. Standard CIA equipment. Everything was transmitted to my colleague in real time. Sarah Chen held up a small device, confirming his statement. Judge Phillips had heard enough. Bailiff, take officers Kendrick and Sullivan into custody for evidence tampering, false imprisonment, and corruption. Lieutenant Driscoll as well, pending further investigation. As the bailiffs moved to arrest the shocked officers, Sullivan broke down. It was Jim's idea. He blurted, pointing at Kendrick. He's been running this for years. Driscoll covers it up, and the captain knows too. Shut up. Kendrick hissed, but it was too late. Sullivan turned to the judge. "I'll testify. I know names, dates, everything." The courtroom erupted into chaos as reporters rushed out to break the story. Federal agents moved in to secure evidence and begin a larger investigation. In the midst of the commotion, Marcus approached Washington. "Thank you for your help, counselor." Washington shook his head in amazement. "CIA, I knew something was off about your case, but I never imagined this." Marcus smiled slightly. "That's rather the point of what we do." As the officers were led away in handcuffs, the tables had completely turned. The men who had arrogantly framed an innocent black man now faced years in prison themselves, brought down by the very person they had underestimated. 2 months after the dramatic courtroom revelation, Marcus Reynolds sat on his mother's porch swing, watching the sunset paint the Oak Ridge sky in shades of orange and purple. The neighborhood had changed since his childhood, but the peaceful evening ritual remained the same. "More iced tea?" his mother asked, stepping onto the porch with a pitcher. "Thanks, Mom." Marcus smiled as she refilled his glass. The local newspaper lay on the table beside him, its headlines still prominently featuring the ongoing police corruption scandal. "FEFO or more OFICRs arrested in expanding investigation." The story had grown far beyond Kendrick and Sullivan, exposing a network of corruption that had infected the Oak Ridge Police Department for nearly a decade. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen. "Task force meeting tomorrow. Your testimony needed again." He typed a quick response confirming his availability. Though he had returned to limited CIA duties, Director Roberts had assigned him temporarily to the joint FBI-CIA task force investigating police corruption in multiple jurisdictions. What began in Oak Ridge had revealed similar patterns in 3 neighboring counties. A car pulled into the driveway, Darius Washington stepping out with a briefcase. The attorney had become an unexpected ally in the aftermath, working with the Justice Department to represent other victims of the corrupt officers. "Sorry to interrupt your evening," Washington said, climbing the porch steps, "but I thought you'd want to see this right away." He handed Marcus a document. It was a plea agreement for Officer Kendrick, who had finally broken after weeks of maintaining his innocence. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he had provided names of corrupt officials reaching as high as the mayor's office. Sullivan's testimony was just the beginning, Washington explained. "Kendrick's deal blows this wide open. The FBI arrested the deputy commissioner this morning." Marcus nodded, scanning the document. "And the victims? The people they framed over the years?" "That's the other news," Washington said, his face brightening. "The governor has established a special review board to examine every case these officers were involved in. So far, 11 convictions have been overturned." From inside the house, the evening news began, and both men turned to listen as the anchor reported. In continuing developments from the Oak Ridge police scandal, former Officer James Kendrick has agreed to testify against higher-ranking officials. Meanwhile, Officer Raymond Sullivan was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison today after pleading guilty to evidence tampering, false imprisonment, and civil rights violations. The report cut to footage of Sullivan being led away in handcuffs, a mirror image of what he had done to countless innocent people over the years. "Justice moves in interesting circles," Marcus observed quietly. Washington checked his watch. "I should go. I'm meeting with another former defendant tomorrow, a truck driver who lost his commercial license after they planted evidence in his vehicle 3 years ago." As Washington drove away, Marcus's mother joined him on the swing. "I still can't believe what happened," she said. "All these years, I warned you about being careful with the police. I never imagined you'd be the one to bring them down." Marcus put his arm around her shoulders. "It wasn't just me. It took Washington's legal work, the CIA's resources, the FBI's jurisdiction, and most importantly, the courage of other victims to come forward." "Will you go back to whatever it is you really do?" she asked. She had accepted his vague explanations about his work for years, never pressing for details she knew he couldn't share. "Soon," he answered, "but this assignment matters too. What happened here is happening elsewhere. Sometimes the work finds you." As darkness settled over Oak Ridge, Marcus reflected on how his simple visit home had transformed an entire community. The corrupt system that had operated with impunity for years had been exposed not through planned operations or targeted investigations, but because they had chosen the wrong man to frame. In his 15 years as a CIA officer, Marcus had helped dismantle terrorist cells and track dangerous criminals across continents. But bringing justice to his hometown might be the most meaningful mission of his career.